A cowboy sunk $5 into a marriage lottery and came up with a bride who was a towering Apache woman. The woman on the platform was arrestingly beautiful, the kind that could steal a man's breath. She topped every man in the crowd by a good head, her dark eyes sweeping the faces below with a look that teetered between scorn and surrender. Her wrists were tied, but loosely, almost ritualistically. When Tobias Crow realized the crumpled ticket in his hand matched the number being shouted, his stomach plunged like a stone, dropped into a bottomless well. This wasn't how he'd pictured it. It wasn't how anyone had pictured it. Tobias had been toiling away at the Fletcher Ranch for 3 straight years without a single day off. His back was a symphony of aches from sunrise to sunset. His hands were calloused slabs of leather, and his bed was a meager blanket in a storage shed that reeked of hay and old regrets. A couple of weeks back, some guy in town had filled him in on this lottery. $5, 1 ticket, 1 bride. Tobias had brushed it off at first, but the loneliness had fangs, and they sank deeper each night. So he'd coughed up his last $5, the money he'd been hoarding for a new pair of boots, and bought a ticket. He'd told himself it was a fool's errand. He'd told himself he was bound to lose. But a tiny ember of hope had flickered nonetheless. Now he was rooted to the spot in the middle of the crowd as heads swiveled to gawk at him. Some faces were split in grins, others shaking in disbelief. A voice behind him grumbled about bad luck, and another man's laughter boomed loud enough to scorch Tobias's ears. He forced his legs to move, shoving through the throng until he stood at the foot of the platform. The woman gazed down at him. Her face was a mask of composure, impossible to read, but her eyes betrayed her. They were the eyes of someone who'd given up on expecting mercy from the world. The lottery man, a burly merchant with a stogie clenched between his teeth, slapped Tobias on the back. "Congratulations, friend! You just won yourself a wife." The word wife sounded like a cruel joke spilling from his lips. Tobias felt the heat creeping up his face. He looked up at the woman again. She was wearing a simple, worn dress that had definitely seen finer days, but it did nothing to diminish her commanding presence. Her hair was a long, black cascade tumbling down her back. Her shoulders were broad, her arms were strong, and the way she carried herself reminded him of a caged wolf, all coiled power waiting to be unleashed. "What's your name?" Tobias asked, his voice barely cutting through the murmur of the crowd. She didn't answer right away. She scrutinized him with those unwavering, dark eyes, and for a heartbeat he thought she might not speak at all. Then, quietly, she said, "Atza." The merchant grinned. "Well, Tobias Crow, you and Atza here are bound by the terms of the lottery. You got 3 days to make it official at the settlement office, or you forfeit your claim. Congratulations again." He untied the rope from her wrists with a flourish, as if presenting a prize-winning stallion. Atza rubbed her wrists slowly, her gaze never wavering from Tobias. The crowd began to thin out. Their entertainment was over. Tobias stood there, unsure of his next move. Atza stepped down from the platform, and he understood just how much taller she was. She moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone of her size. When she stood before him, he had to tip his head back a bit to meet her eyes. "You do not want this," she stated. It wasn't a question. Tobias opened his mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He didn't want this, but he was also at a loss for what else to do. and beneath the fear and confusion, a different emotion was stirring, something he couldn't yet put a name to. Before he could say anything, a voice bellowed from across the square. "Crow, that your new woman?" It was Harlan, one of the ranch hands. And he wasn't alone. 3 other men flanked him, all of them grinning like they'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. And in that instant, Tobias knew that whatever came next would determine more than just his relationship with Atsa. It would decide whether he could ever hold his head high in this town again. Harlan swaggered across the square with the cocksure confidence of a man who'd never been told no. The other 3 ranch hands trailed behind like shadows, their boots kicking up dust with each purposeful stride. Tobias felt his throat constrict. He knew these men, how their minds worked, what they were gearing up to do. "Crow, you gonna introduce us to your prize?" Harlan stopped a few feet away. His eyes raked up and down Atsa with a look that made Tobias's skin crawl. "Heard you blew your boot money on a ticket. Guess you figured you wouldn't need boots if you were gonna be on your back all day." The other men guffawed, and heat flooded Tobias's face. Atsa didn't react. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but Tobias noticed her hands. They were clenched into fists at her sides. Harlan noticed too. He grinned wider. "She looks like she could snap you in half." "Crow, you sure you know what you're doing?" Tobias forced himself to speak. "Leave it alone, Harlan. Just leave it alone." Harlan took a step closer. "You won her fair and square, right? So that means she belongs to you now. Just like a horse, just like a piece of land." He reached out as if to grab Atsa's arm, and a sharp, cold feeling settled in Tobias's chest. But before he could move, Atsa did. She seized Harlan's wrist mid-reach. Her grip was like iron. Harlan's grin faltered, replaced by something uglier. He tried to wrench his hand free, but she held firm. The square had fallen silent. People had stopped to watch. Atsa leaned down slightly, bringing her face level with Harlan's, and when she spoke, her voice was low and steady. "Touch me again, and you will lose the hand." Harlan yanked his arm free. His face was flushed red. "You hear that? She's threatening me. That's assault, Crow. You better teach your woman some manners before someone else does." He turned to the gathering crowd, raising his voice. "This is what happens when you let savages walk around like they're people. They forget their place." The word hit Tobias like a physical blow. He saw Atsa's jaw tighten, the way her shoulders went rigid, and he realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just about him. This was about every man in this town who saw her as something less than human, something to be used, mocked, broken. Tobias stepped forward, placing himself between Harlan and Atsa. His voice came out quieter than he intended, but it was steady. "She's not yours to touch, and she's not yours to insult." Harlan stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. "You defending her now? A woman who could probably bench press you? That's rich, Crow. Real rich." He turned to leave, then paused. "Enjoy your wedding night, if you survive it." The other men followed, their laughter echoing across the square. When they were gone, Tobias turned to face Atsa. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know. They will make your life worse now. I know that too." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. For the first time since he'd seen her on the platform, something in her eyes softened. Not much, just enough for him to notice. "Why did you buy the ticket?" Tobias hesitated. The truth felt too heavy to say out loud, too pathetic. But standing there with her towering over him and the weight of the entire town's judgment pressing down, he found himself answering honestly, "Because I was alone, and I thought maybe someone else was too." Atsa didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was quieter. "The man who ran the lottery. He bought me from a traitor 3 months ago. I was taken from my people after I fought back against men who tried to hurt a child. They said I was dangerous. Said I couldn't be trusted. So they sold me." She paused, her gaze distant. "I've been sold 4 times since then. Each time they promise it will be different. Each time it's the same." Tobias felt something crack open inside his chest. I'm not like them." "Maybe," Atsa said. "Or maybe you just haven't had the chance yet." Before Tobias could respond, a man in a dark coat approached. He was older, with silver hair and a badge pinned to his chest. The town marshal. He looked at Tobias, then at Atsa, then back at Tobias. "You Crow?" "Yes, sir." "Got a complaint from Harlan Briggs. Says your woman threatened him. That true?" The marshal's tone was flat, bored, like he'd already made up his mind. Tobias glanced at Atsa. She was watching the marshal with the same calm, unreadable expression. He could tell her to stay quiet. He could let this play out the way it always did, or he could do something different. He looked back at the marshal. Harlan tried to touch her without permission. She stopped him. That's all. The marshal studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "You got 3 days to make this official, or she goes back on the block. My advice, keep her out of town until then. People around here don't take kindly to trouble." He turned and walked away, leaving Tobias and Atsa standing alone in the emptying square. Atsa spoke first. "You have a place to take me?" Tobias thought of the storage shed. The thin blanket, the smell of hay. Not really. Then we have a problem. The storage shed behind the Fletcher ranch was barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 2. Tobias stood in the doorway, staring at the cramped space that had been his home for 3 years, and felt a wave of shame wash over him. Atsa stood behind him, silent. She hadn't said a word during the long walk from town. He could feel her presence at his back, tall and solid and impossible to ignore. "This is where you live?" Her voice held no judgment, but Tobias felt it anyway. "The main house is full. Ranch hands sleep in the bunkhouse." But he trailed off. The bunkhouse was out of the question. 20 men crammed into 1 room, most of them no better than Harlan. Taking Atsa there would be like throwing her to the wolves. "I know it's not much." Atsa stepped past him into the shed. She had to duck slightly to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling. She looked around at the single blanket, the wooden crate he used as a table, the small pile of belongings in the corner. Then she turned to face him. "You gave up your last $5 for a chance at something better than this." It wasn't a question, but Tobias nodded anyway. "And now you're stuck with me." She sat down on the ground, her back against the wall. Even sitting, she took up most of the space. "You should have walked away when you saw me on that platform. Told them you made a mistake. Asked for your money back." "I thought about it," Tobias admitted. He sat down across from her, their knees almost touching in the cramped space. But then I thought about what would happen to you if I did. Atsa's eyes narrowed. You think you saved me? No. I think I made everything more complicated. He rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be married. I don't know how to take care of someone else when I can barely take care of myself. Then why are you still here? The question hung in the air between them. Tobias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the height and the strength and the intimidating presence. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching, the way her hands shook slightly before she clenched them into fists. Because I'm tired of being alone, he said quietly. And I think maybe you are too. Atsa held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, her jaw tight. Being alone is safer. Safer than what? Than trusting someone who will eventually hurt you. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was stating an obvious truth. I trusted my people. They sold me. I trusted the first man who bought me. He worked me like an animal until I collapsed. I trusted the second one. He tried to... She stopped, her hands curling into fists again. The third one was smarter. He just sold me before I could fight back. And now, here I am with you, a man I don't know, in a place I don't want to be, with 3 days before they decide what to do with me next. Tobias felt something tighten in his chest. I'm not going to hurt you. You say that now. I mean it. Atsa laughed, but there was no humor in it. Every man means it, until they don't. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. You should sleep. Tomorrow, you'll need to explain to your boss why you brought home a woman taller than his horses. Tobias wanted to argue, to say something that would make her believe him, but he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. So, instead, he reached for the blanket and held it out to her. Here, you take it. She opened her eyes, looking at the blanket, then at him. Where will you sleep? I'll figure something out. That's foolish. Maybe. He kept holding the blanket out. But I'm not going to make you sleep on bare ground. Atsa stared at him for another moment, then took the blanket. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Tobias felt something electric pass between them. She must have felt it too, because she pulled back quickly, her eyes widening slightly. For just a second he saw something vulnerable flash across her face before the walls went back up. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made them both freeze. Someone was approaching the shed. Tobias stood quickly, stepping outside. It was Fletcher, the ranch owner. He was a heavy man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Tobias, then peered past him into the shed where Atsa sat, and his expression darkened. Heard you got yourself a wife, Crow? Yes, sir. Heard she's Apache? Yes, sir. Fletcher was quiet for a moment, chewing on something Tobias couldn't see. Then he spat into the dirt. You got 48 hours to get her off my property. I don't care where you go or what you do, but I won't have her here. Understood? Tobias felt the ground tremble under his feet. Mr. Fletcher, 48 hours, Crow. And if you're smart, you'll go with her, because come dawn, every man in that bunkhouse is going to know there's an Apache woman sleeping 20 feet away, and I can't promise they'll leave her alone. Fletcher turned and walked away, leaving Tobias standing in the darkness with the weight of impossible choices bearing down on him. Inside the shed, Atsa spoke quietly. You heard him. You have 48 hours to decide if I'm worth losing everything you have. There was no challenge in her voice, just resignation, like she'd already decided what his answer would be. And Tobias realized, standing there in the dark, that he had no idea what he was going to do. Tobias didn't sleep that night. He sat outside the shed with his back against the wooden wall, watching the stars crawl across the sky and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Inside, Atsa's breathing was steady and deep. She'd fallen asleep quickly, like someone who had learned to snatch rest whenever she could find it. He envied that. His mind wouldn't stop churning over Fletcher's words. 48 hours. Get her off my property. Every man in that bunkhouse is going to know. When the first light began to seep over the horizon, Tobias stood and stretched his stiff muscles. He had come to a decision sometime in the murky hours before dawn. It was probably the dumbest decision of his life, but it was the only one that felt right. He knocked softly on the shed door. "Atsa, we need to move." She was awake instantly, sitting up and looking at him with alert eyes. No grogginess, no confusion, just immediate readiness. "Where are we going?" "Away from here, before the others wake up." He kept his voice low. The bunkhouse was close enough that loud voices would carry. "There's a settlement about 2 days' ride north. Small place. They might have work. Might have a place we can stay." Atsa stood, ducking under the low ceiling. "You're leaving the ranch." "I don't have a choice." "You do." She stepped closer, and in the dim light he could see the conflict swirling in her eyes. "You can tell Fletcher I ran off in the night. Tell him you tried to stop me, but I was too strong. No one would question it. You could keep your job, keep your life." Tobias met her gaze. "And what happens to you?" "The same thing that always happens." Her voice was flat. "I survive. I always do." "That's not good enough." "It has to be, because I will not let you destroy yourself for me. I am not worth it." She said it with such conviction that Tobias felt something crumble inside him. She truly believed it. After everything she had endured, she had come to see herself as something disposable, something not worth saving. "You're wrong," Tobias said quietly, "about yourself, about what you're worth, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." He turned toward the main house. "Wait here. I need to get my pay from Fletcher." "He won't give it to you." "Then I'll take what I'm owed." Tobias started walking, his heart pounding. He had never stolen anything in his life, had never even raised his voice to an employer. But something had shifted in him during the long night, something that made him angrier than he had ever been. The main house was dark. Tobias slipped in through the back door, moving as quietly as he could. He knew where Fletcher kept the cash box, had seen him open it 100 times when paying the hands. The office was unlocked. Tobias found the box on the desk, opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were bills and coins. He counted out 3 months of wages. What he was owed, nothing more. He closed the box, turned to leave, and found Fletcher standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Fletcher's expression was unreadable. Then he sighed and stepped aside. "Get out of here, Crow, and don't come back." Tobias blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. "You're letting me go?" "I'm letting you leave with what's yours. There's a difference." Fletcher's voice was hard, but not unkind. "I meant what I said last night. I can't have her here, but I also can't stomach the thought of what those men would do if she stayed. So, take your money, take your woman, and get as far from here as you can." Tobias wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what had changed. But Fletcher's expression told him not to push his luck. He nodded once and walked past, clutching the money in his fist. When he returned to the shed, Atsa was standing outside, her few belongings wrapped in a piece of cloth. She looked at the money in his hand. "He gave it to you, more or less." Tobias tucked the bills into his pocket. "We need to go now, before anyone else wakes up." They moved quickly through the pre-dawn darkness, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the edge of the property. Tobias kept glancing back, expecting to hear shouting, to see men pouring out of the bunkhouse, but the ranch stayed quiet. They reached the main road just as the sun broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Atsa stopped walking and turned to look back at the ranch. Tobias stopped beside her. "What is it?" "I was trying to remember the last time someone chose me over something easier." Her voice was soft, almost wondering. "I cannot." Tobias didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and watched the sunrise with her. After a moment, Atsa spoke again. "The settlement you mentioned, 2 days north. You've been there before?" "No." "So you don't know if there's work or a place to stay, or if they'll even let me through the gates?" "No," Tobias admitted. "I don't know any of that." Atsa nodded slowly. Then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was small and cautious, like something fragile trying to break through stone. Then, "I guess we find out together." They started walking again, side by side, as the sun climbed higher and the road stretched out before them. Behind them, the ranch disappeared into the distance, and with it, the only life Tobias had known for years. He should have felt afraid, should have felt the weight of uncertainty crushing down on him, but instead, walking beside Atsa with the morning light on his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt hope. That hope lasted exactly 3 miles. That was when they saw the riders approaching from the north. 4 men on horseback, moving fast, and leading them was Harlan Briggs. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out across the road to block their path. Harlan sat in the center, his expression smug. The other 3 men Tobias recognized from the ranch. One of them was holding a coiled rope. Another had a rifle resting across his saddle, though he hadn't raised it yet. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take— "Well, well," Harlan said, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Look what we found. A thief and his property running away in the night." He directed the last word at Atsa, his eyes traveling over her with the kind of look that— the thought made Tobias's stomach churn. "We aren't running," Tobias stated, struggling to keep his voice even. "We're leaving. There's a difference." "Not according to Fletcher. He sent us to bring back what's his." Harlan leaned forward in his saddle. "See, turns out that lottery you won, it wasn't exactly legal, which means that woman there doesn't belong to you. She belongs to the man who paid for her, and he wants his investment back." Tobias felt the ground give way beneath him. "You're lying." "Am I?" Harlan grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. "Ask her. Ask her who really owns her. Go on." Tobias turned to Asa. Her face was utterly still, but he could see a dark, furious storm brewing behind her eyes. "Is it true?" "The merchant who ran the lottery. she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "He didn't have the right to sell me, but he did it anyway. He does that, buys people who no one will miss, sells them to whoever has the money, and when they try to leave—" She gestured at the riders with a subtle movement. "He sends men to bring them back." The man with the rifle shifted, raising it slightly, not aiming yet, just making sure everyone saw it. "You got two choices, Crow," Harlan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Walk away now, and we forget this ever happened. Or try to keep her and find out what happens to thieves around here." Tobias's mind raced, a whirlwind of desperate calculations. 4 armed men on horses, him and Atsa on foot, with nowhere to run and nothing to fight with except sheer desperation. The smart choice was obvious, the safe choice, the choice that would let him live to see tomorrow. He looked at Asa again. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, waiting to see what he would do, expecting him to walk away, to abandon her like everyone else had. "No," Tobias said, the word hanging in the air. Harlan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "No?" "No," Tobias repeated, his voice gaining strength. "She doesn't belong to anyone. Not to me. Not to your merchant friend. Not to you." Tobias stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Atsa and the riders, a human shield against the threat they represented. His hands were shaking, trembling with adrenaline, but he kept them at his sides, refusing to let them betray his fear. "So you can turn around and go back. Tell whoever sent you that she's gone, that you couldn't find us." One of the other riders laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You got nerve, Crow. Stupid nerve, but nerve." He started to dismount, clearly intending to escalate the situation. That was when Atsa moved. She didn't hesitate, didn't offer a warning. She just moved, a blur of motion and unleashed fury. Her hand shot out and grabbed the reins of the nearest horse, yanking hard, with surprising strength. The animal reared up, startled and unbalanced, and the rider went tumbling backward into the dust with a surprised yelp. Before the others could react, Atsa had already snatched the fallen man's rifle and swung it like a club, striking the second rider's horse hard across the flank. The horse bolted, a whinny of panic escaping its throat, carrying its rider away in a terrified gallop. Harlan, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, tried to draw his pistol, but Tobias was faster, driven by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate need to protect Atsa. He lunged forward and grabbed Harlan's leg, pulling hard with all his might. Harlan cursed, a string of colorful epithets spewing from his lips, and kicked wildly, trying to dislodge Tobias. But Tobias held on with everything he had, his grip like a vice. They both went down in a tangle of limbs and dust, a chaotic heap of struggling bodies. Tobias felt something crack against his ribs, a sharp, agonizing pain that exploded through his chest, but he didn't let go, clinging to Harlan's leg like a lifeline. The fourth rider had his rifle up now, aiming directly at Asa. She saw it and dove to the side just as the shot rang out, the deafening crack echoing through the air. The bullet hit the dirt where she had been standing a split second before, kicking up a small cloud of dust. She rolled, came up running, and slammed into the horse before the rider could fire again, her body a weapon of pure momentum. The impact was enough to make the animal stumble, its legs momentarily losing their footing, and the rider dropped the rifle, instinctively trying to maintain his balance and hold on. Atsa grabbed the rifle and threw it as far as she could into the brush, sending it clattering through the undergrowth. Then she turned back to the rider, her chest heaving with exertion, her eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "Get out of here now," she said, her voice low and menacing, "before I change my mind about letting you leave." The rider looked at her, his face a mask of fear and grudging respect, then at his companions. One was groaning on the ground, clutching his head. One was still frantically chasing his runaway horse, his shouts growing fainter in the distance. Harlan was struggling under Tobias's weight, his face contorted with rage and frustration. The rider made his decision. He kicked his horse and rode off without looking back, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Atsa walked over to where Tobias was still pinning Harlan to the ground. She crouched down, bringing her face close to his, her expression unreadable. "You tell your merchant friend," she said, her voice a low growl, "that if he sends anyone else after me, I won't be this kind again. Understood?" Harlan spat blood into the dirt, a gesture of defiance, but nodded his head in grudging acknowledgement. Atsa stood and gestured for Tobias to let him go. When he did, Harlan scrambled to his feet and ran for his horse, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Within moments, he and the other rider were gone, leaving only dust and the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. Tobias stood slowly, clutching his ribs, each movement sending a jolt of pain through his body. The pain was sharp and insistent, a constant reminder of the beating he had just taken. Atsa was at his side immediately, her face etched with concern. "You're hurt." "I'll live," he said, trying to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "You didn't need my help." "Yes, I did." She was examining his side with careful fingers, her touch surprisingly gentle. "If you hadn't grabbed Harlan, he would have shot me. You saved my life." "You saved mine first," Tobias countered, remembering the moment in the square when she had stopped him from making a fool of himself. "Back in the square, when you stopped him from making me look like a fool." Tobias looked at her, really looked at her, at the way the morning light caught in her dark hair, at the strength in her hands and the vulnerability in her eyes. "I think we're even." Atsa held his gaze for a long moment, her expression softening. Then she did something unexpected, something that took him completely by surprise. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a brief but profound gesture of connection. It was brief, lasting only a second, but Tobias felt the gesture all the way through to his bones, a wave of warmth and something akin to understanding washing over him. A sign of respect, of trust, of something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. When she pulled back, her expression was serious, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "We can't go north now. They'll be watching the roads. We need to go somewhere they wouldn't think to look." "Where?" Tobias asked, his voice raspy with pain. Atsa looked toward the east, where the land rose into rocky hills and sparse trees, a wild and unforgiving landscape. "My people used to have hunting grounds in those hills. There are caves, hidden places. We could hide there until it's safe to move again." "Your people," Tobias repeated, the words hanging in the air, a reminder of the complicated past that haunted her. "The ones who sold you." "Not all of them," Atsa said, her voice hardening, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "Just the ones who were afraid." She started walking toward the hills, her movements purposeful and determined. "The ones who aren't afraid. They might still help if I can find them." Tobias followed, each step sending a sharp pain through his ribs, each breath a reminder of his vulnerability. But he followed anyway because the alternative was going back, and going back meant losing her. And he wasn't ready to do that. Not now. Not after everything. He just hoped the cave she was talking about actually existed, and that her people, if they found them, wouldn't decide to finish what the riders had started. The climb into the hills took most of the day, a grueling test of endurance. Tobias's ribs screamed with each step, a constant throbbing ache that threatened to overwhelm him, and by midday he was sweating through his shirt despite the cool air, his body protesting with every movement. Atsa walked ahead, moving with the kind of certainty that came from memory, her feet sure on the uneven terrain. She knew these paths, had walked them before, her connection to this land deep and ingrained. Every so often she would stop and wait for him to catch up, her eyes scanning the rocks above them, as if she were reading a language he didn't understand, searching for signs, for clues, for something he couldn't see. They reached the caves just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The entrance was hidden behind a fall of brush and stone, carefully concealed, easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. Atsa pushed through the brush and disappeared into the darkness, her movements fluid and silent, a creature of the wilderness. Tobias followed, his hand pressed against his injured ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space, cool and dry, a welcome respite from the harshness of the outside world. Light filtered in through cracks in the rock above, creating intricate patterns on the stone floor, a play of light and shadow that danced across the ancient surfaces. Atsa was standing in the center of the cave, her head tilted back, looking at something on the wall, her gaze fixed on a point in the darkness. Tobias moved closer and saw markings, symbols painted in faded red and black, ancient pictographs that told a story he couldn't decipher. He couldn't read them, but Atsa could. Her fingers traced the lines gently, a reverent touch that spoke of a deep connection to the past. "This was a winter camp," she said quietly, her voice echoing softly in the cave. "My grandmother brought me here when I was young, taught me which plants were safe to eat, which tracks belonged to deer, and which to predators." She lowered her hand, her expression clouding with a hint of sadness. "She died the winter before I was taken." Tobias wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words felt inadequate, insufficient to express the depth of her loss. So he just stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a silent offering of support. After a moment, Atsa moved deeper into the cave, her movements regaining their purpose. She knelt beside a pile of stones and began moving them aside, her hands working quickly and efficiently. Beneath was a small cache, hidden and preserved, old blankets wrapped tight and somehow still intact, a leather pouch containing dried herbs, their scent still potent after all these years, a knife with a bone handle, its blade worn smooth with use. She held up the knife, examining it in the dim light, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the handle. She left these here, supplies for anyone who needed them. She always said, "The land provides, but only if you are wise enough to prepare." "She sounds like she was strong," Tobias said, his voice filled with admiration. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," Atsa replied, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. Atsa set the knife down and unwrapped one of the blankets, spreading it out on the ground. "Sit. Let me look at your ribs." Tobias hesitated, his body stiff with pain, then sat down on a flat rock, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. Atza knelt in front of him and lifted his shirt carefully, her movements gentle but firm, her touch surprisingly confident. Her fingers were gentle but firm as they probed his side, searching for the extent of the damage. He winced when she touched a particularly tender spot, a sharp intake of breath escaping his lips. "2 ribs cracked, maybe broken," she said, her voice matter of fact. "You need rest, and you need to stop moving so much." "We don't have time for rest," Tobias protested, his voice laced with urgency. "We do now," Atza said, her voice firm and unwavering. She took the herbs from the pouch and crushed them between her palms, releasing their potent aroma into the air. The smell was sharp and clean, like mint mixed with something medicinal, a blend of natural remedies passed down through generations. "This will help with the pain?" "My grandmother taught me." She pressed the crushed herbs against his skin, and he felt an immediate cooling relief, a soothing balm that eased the throbbing ache in his ribs. Then she took strips of cloth from one of the blankets and began wrapping his ribs, binding them tight, providing support and stability. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, each movement precise and deliberate, and Tobias found himself watching her face instead of what she was doing, drawn to the strength and determination etched in her features. There was something different about her here, something softer, something more vulnerable, as if being in this place, surrounded by the echoes of her past, had peeled back a layer of armor, revealing the woman beneath. "Why did you really leave your people?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Atza's hands paused in their work, her movements faltering for a moment. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on his injured ribs. "I told you I fought back against men who tried to hurt a child, but there's more to it than that." She finally looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "I can see it in your eyes every time you talk about them." She finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels, her expression somber. For a long moment she was silent, lost in thought, wrestling with the memories that haunted her. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, her words filled with a raw, unfiltered pain. "The child was my sister's daughter. She was 8 years old. There were traders who came to our camp, white men looking to buy horses, but they wanted more than horses. They saw her, and they—" Atza's jaw tightened, her voice trailing off, unable to articulate the horror of what almost happened. "I stopped them, broke one man's arm, nearly killed the other, but the traders had money, had influence. They went to the town marshal and said we had attacked them without cause." "The elders were afraid," she continued, her voice filled with bitterness. "Afraid of what would happen if they protected me. Afraid the marshal would come with soldiers, so they made a choice." She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "They sold me to the same traders I had fought, said it was justice, said it would keep the peace." Tobias felt something cold and furious settle in his stomach, a churning anger that threatened to consume him. "And your niece safe. That's all that matters," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Atza stood, turning away from him, unable to face him. "The elders made the choice they thought they had to make. I don't blame them for being afraid, but I'll never forgive them for it." Tobias stood as well, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs, driven by an overwhelming need to comfort her. He crossed the cave and stood behind her, his presence a silent offering of support. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder, his fingers brushing against her skin. She didn't pull away, her body tense but unyielding. "You sacrificed everything for her," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I would do it again," she replied, her voice barely audible. "I know." He squeezed her shoulder gently, offering what comfort he could. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." Atsa turned to face him, her eyes searching his, questioning his sincerity. They were close now, closer than they had ever been. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, close enough to see the unshed tears she was fighting to hold back. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough with emotion. "Why do you keep choosing me? You could have walked away a dozen times, could have saved yourself." "Why didn't you?" Tobias thought about the question, about the shed and the loneliness and the desperate gamble on a $5 lottery ticket, about the moment he first saw her on that platform and felt something shift inside him, a flicker of hope in the darkness. "Because," he said slowly, his voice filled with a newfound conviction, "I spent 3 years sleeping alone in a shed, telling myself I was fine, telling myself I didn't need anyone, and then I saw you, and I realized I'd been lying to myself the whole time. I did need someone. I needed someone who understood what it felt like to be thrown away, someone strong enough to survive it." He stopped, searching for the right words to express the depth of his feelings. "Someone like you." Atsa stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and something akin to hope. Then, without warning, she closed the distance between them. Her lips found his in a kiss that was fierce and desperate and filled with something that felt like relief, a release of pent-up emotions. Tobias froze for half a heartbeat, surprised by the intensity of her gesture, then kissed her back, his hands coming up to frame her face, his fingers tracing the strong lines of her jaw. She was taller, stronger, everything about her overwhelming, but in that moment, holding her and being held by her, he had never felt more certain of anything in his life, a sense of belonging he had never known before. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Atsa rested her forehead against his, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "If we do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's no going back. They'll hunt us, the merchant, the town, maybe even my people. We'll have nothing but each other." Tobias smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Despite everything, I've been living with nothing for years. Having you sounds like everything." Outside the cave, the sun had set completely, and darkness was settling over the hills, blanketing the landscape in shadow. And in that darkness, neither of them heard the footsteps approaching, the telltale crunch of boots on gravel. Neither of them saw the figure standing at the cave entrance until a voice spoke from the shadows, breaking the silence. "Atsa, I've been looking for you." They both spun around, startled by the sudden intrusion. Standing in the entrance, backlit by moonlight, was a woman, her form silhouetted against the night sky. She was older, with grey streaking through her dark hair, a sign of age and experience, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that needed no weapon, a natural presence that commanded respect. Atsa's entire body went rigid, her muscles tensing, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Nalnish," she breathed, her voice a mixture of surprise and apprehension. The name sounded like both a prayer and a curse, a complex blend of emotions. The woman stepped into the cave, and Tobias saw the resemblance immediately, the shared features that marked them as sisters. Same high cheekbones, same dark eyes, same fierce presence. "Hello, sister," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Atsa stood frozen, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt, a reflexive gesture of self-defense. Nalnish noticed the movement and raised her hand slowly, palms out, a gesture of peace. "I didn't come to fight you." "Then why did you come?" Atsa's voice was cold, guarded, filled with suspicion. Nalnish's eyes moved to Tobias, assessing him with a single glance, taking in his injuries and his protective stance. "Is this the man from the lottery? The one who refused to give you back to the merchant's riders?" When neither of them answered, she nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Word travels fast in these hills, faster than you think. There are people who saw the fight on the road, who saw him stand between you and 4 armed men." She looked back at Atsa, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. "People are talking, sister, saying maybe you've finally found someone who sees you as more than a weapon or a burden. What do you want, Nalnish?" Atsa's voice was sharp, cutting through the pretense, demanding honesty. Nalnish lowered her hand slowly, her expression serious. "The elders sent me. They want to offer you something. I want nothing from them, not even your freedom." Nalnish pulled a folded paper from inside her coat, her movements deliberate and measured. "This is a deed, legal ownership. It says that you belong to no one, not the merchant, not the traders, no one. The elders bought your contract from the merchant 2 days ago, used most of the tribe's savings to do it." She held out the paper, offering it to Atsa. "You're free, Atsa, free to go wherever you want, free to live however you choose." Atsa stared at the paper like it might be poisoned, her eyes filled with suspicion and disbelief. "Why would they do that?" "Because my daughter hasn't stopped asking about you since you left." Nalnisha's voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of her emotions. "Every night she asks when you're coming home. Every night I have to tell her I don't know. She's 10 now. She remembers what you did for her, what you sacrificed, and she wants to see you again." Tobias watched Ata's face carefully, his heart aching for her. He saw the war happening behind her eyes, the conflict between anger, longing, and fear, the tug-of-war between the past and the present. "What's the price?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. "No price." Nalnish took a step closer, her eyes pleading. "But there's a condition." Atsa's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "There's always a condition. If you come back for good. No more running, no more being sold. You'd have a place with us again, a home, your niece, your family." She paused, her voice laced with pain. "But you'd have to leave him behind." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Tobias felt his chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. Of course there was a condition. There was always a condition. Nalnish looked at him directly now, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and regret. "The elders won't allow you in our camp. You're not one of us. And after everything that's happened, they can't risk more conflict with the settlements. It's not personal. It's survival." "It's cowardice," Atsa said, her voice low and dangerous. "Maybe." Nalnish didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "But it's also the only way they could justify spending everything they had to free you. They told themselves they were saving one of their own, bringing you home. But they can't do that if you bring him with you." Tobias forced himself to speak, his voice calm and steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "Atsa, take it." She whipped around to face him, her eyes wide with disbelief and anger. "What?" "Take the offer. Go back to your people. See your niece again." He kept his voice steady, even though everything inside him was screaming, protesting the idea of losing her. "You said it yourself. We'll have nothing but each other. But this way, you'll have everything. A home, family, freedom. Real freedom, not just running." "And what will you have?" Atsa's eyes were fierce, searching his face for any sign of weakness. "You'll go back to sleeping in sheds, working yourself to death, being alone," she continued, her voice rising. "I'll survive. I always do." He echoed her words from before, a subtle reminder of her own resilience, and saw her flinch at them. "This is different than me. You have a chance to get your life back. I never had one to lose. You think I could go back there and be happy?" Atsa stepped closer to him, her voice rising, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Knowing I left you, knowing I chose comfort over the one person who actually chose me first." She turned back to Nalnish, her decision made. "Tell the elders I appreciate the gesture, but I won't come back. Not under those terms." Nalnish sighed, her shoulders sagging with resignation. "I knew you'd say that. So did they, if I'm honest. But I had to try, for my daughter's sake." She tucked the paper back into her coat, her expression somber. "There's something else you should know. The merchant who owned your contract, he's not happy about the elders interfering. He's been asking questions, offering money for information about where you might have gone. And there are men in the settlements who'll do anything for money." "How long do we have?" Tobias asked, his mind racing. "A day? Maybe 2. Nalnish looked between them, her eyes filled with concern. "There's a place 3 days' ride west, a settlement near the border. Small enough that the merchant's reach doesn't extend that far. Rough enough that people don't ask questions. You could disappear there. Start over." "Why are you telling us this?" Atsa asked, her voice filled with suspicion. Nalnish smiled sadly, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Because you're my sister, and because maybe the elders are wrong. Maybe choosing someone who chooses you back is worth more than safety." She walked to the cave entrance, then paused and looked back, her gaze lingering on Atsa. "My daughter's name is Ka now. She changed it last year. Said she wanted a name that meant her life was her own. I thought you should know that. What you did for her, it mattered." Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness outside, leaving behind a silence that was heavy with unspoken emotions. Atsa stood very still, staring at the empty entrance, her face unreadable. Tobias waited, giving her time to process everything she had just heard. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You were really going to let me go?" "Yes," he said, his voice honest and unwavering. "Even though it would have destroyed you?" "Yes." She crossed to him in 3 long strides and pulled him into a fierce embrace, her arms wrapping tightly around him. He gasped as pain shot through his ribs, but he didn't pull away, welcoming the closeness, the connection. "You're an idiot," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled but filled with affection. "A stubborn, selfless idiot. I know we could have that life, the safe one, the easy one. All I would have to do is walk away from you." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes filled with a newfound certainty. "But I don't want easy. I want real. and you're the only real thing I've found in years." Tobias cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs gently tracing the lines of her cheekbones. "Then we go west. 3 days. We find that settlement, and we start over together." "Together," she repeated, her voice soft, a promise being sealed. Then she kissed him again, softer this time, a gentle exploration of trust and affection. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, careful of his injured ribs, her body relaxed and pliant against his. "We should leave before dawn, before anyone else finds us." "Agreed," Tobias said, holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, finding solace in her presence. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, a storm brewing on the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard horses, the faint echo of hooves on the rocky ground. But maybe it was just his imagination, his paranoia, fueled by fear. Maybe it was just the fear that had been following them since the moment he won that lottery ticket, a constant companion that whispered in the back of his mind. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on the feeling of her in his arms, the warmth of her body, the strength of her embrace. Solid, real, worth every risk. They had 3 days to reach safety, 3 days to outrun the merchant and his men, 3 days before they could finally stop looking over their shoulders, before they could finally find a moment of peace. But first, they had to survive the night. And as the sound of horses grew louder, closer, Tobias realized with cold certainty that surviving might be harder than he thought, because whoever was coming wasn't being careful, wasn't trying to conceal their approach. They weren't hiding their approach, which meant they didn't care if they were heard, which meant they were confident, emboldened by their numbers and their purpose. And confidence in men like that usually meant numbers. Numbers they couldn't fight, numbers they could only run from, if they were fast enough, if they were lucky enough, if they had any luck left at all. The sound of horses grew louder, a thunderous cacophony that echoed through the hills. Tobias counted at least 6, maybe more, a formidable force bearing down on them. Too many to fight, too many to reason with. Atsa grabbed his hand and pulled him deeper into the cave, her movements swift and decisive. "There's another way out, a passage my grandmother showed me. It's narrow, but we can fit." They moved quickly through the darkness, Atsa navigating by memory, her footsteps sure and silent, while Tobias kept one hand on her back, guiding her, and the other pressed against his aching ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, voices echoed into the cave, a chorus of menacing sounds, men shouting, boots scraping on stone, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. The merchant had sent more than just riders this time. He had sent hunters, men who were skilled at tracking and relentless in their pursuit. The passage Atsa led them through was barely wide enough for her shoulders, a claustrophobic tunnel that snaked through the rock. Tobias had to turn sideways in places, contorting his body to squeeze through the narrow openings, biting back groans as the movement pulled at his injured ribs, sending jolts of pain through his body. But they kept moving, kept pushing forward, driven by the instinct for survival, until finally the passage opened up, and they stumbled out onto a jagged, rocky hillside. The night air slammed into them, shockingly cold. Down below, they spotted torches weaving through the darkness. The men were fanning out, searching methodically. "They'll find the passage eventually," she whispered urgently. "We need to gain some distance, and fast." Her gaze darted westward, toward the settlement Nish had described. 3 days on foot, maybe 2 if they really pushed themselves and didn't stop to rest. But Tobias was already faltering. His breathing was ragged and shallow, and his face was ashen even in the pale moonlight. "I'm going to slow you down," he admitted, his voice strained. "Then we'll go slow together." Atsa gently took his arm and looped it around her shoulders, supporting as much of his weight as she could manage. "We've made it this far. We're not giving up now." Like ghosts, they crept through the inky night, melting into every shadow and using every jutting rock for cover. Atsa's intimate knowledge of the terrain kept them a step ahead of their pursuers. She could discern which paths would betray them with noise and which would remain silent. She knew where the streams ran, obscuring their tracks and making them harder to follow. She knew how to read the stars, guiding them unerringly in the right direction, even when bone-deep exhaustion threatened to drag them both down. By the time the sun clawed its way above the horizon on that first day, they had put a considerable distance between themselves and the cave. But the relentless pursuit continued unabated. Throughout that day and the next, they caught glimpses of riders on the distant horizon and saw telltale plumes of smoke rising from hastily erected camps. The merchant wasn't about to give up. He had sunk too much money into this, lost too much face. This had transcended mere financial concerns. It had become a matter of wounded pride. On the second night, they stumbled upon a meager shelter in a dried-up riverbed beneath a rocky overhang. Tobias's fever had spiked that afternoon, his body finally succumbing to the stress of the cracked ribs and the constant, punishing movement. Ata cradled him close, shivering, using her own body heat in a desperate attempt to keep him warm. She murmured to him in her native tongue, words he couldn't comprehend, but that sounded like a mix of heartfelt prayers and solemn promises. "I'm slowing you down," he mumbled, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You're keeping me human," she countered softly. "Without you, I'd be nothing but survival, just anger, just running. With you, I have a reason to stop running, a reason to build something instead of just enduring." She gently kissed his forehead. "So rest now. Tomorrow we reach the settlement. Tomorrow we start over." The third day dawned grey and bitterly cold. Tobias's fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him weak and drained, but with a clear head. They helped each other to their feet and pressed on, their determination renewed. By midday they saw it. A cluster of buildings nestled snugly in a protective valley, smoke curling lazily from the chimneys, the sounds of hammers and voices carried on the crisp wind. The settlement, small, unrefined, and breathtakingly beautiful in its utter isolation. They walked into town together, 2 figures who looked like they had just emerged from the crucible of war. And in a way, they had. The settlement was precisely as Nish had described it, rough and tumble enough that people didn't pry too much, isolated enough that the merchant's insidious influence hadn't yet reached it. The first person they approached was a woman who ran a local boarding house. She took one look at them, her eyes assessing, and nodded curtly toward the stairs. "Oh, $2 a week, meals included, no trouble." "No trouble," Atsa agreed readily. That night, after they had eaten a hearty meal, washed away the grime of the journey, and finally felt secure enough to breathe freely, they stood together in the cramped room they had rented. It boasted a real bed, a real window, a real door that locked from the inside, luxuries they hadn't realized how much they missed until they had them again. Tobias reached out and gently took Atsa's hand in his. "I know this isn't exactly what you pictured when you thought about getting married. No ceremony, no witnesses, no fancy dress, just us and a room barely bigger than the shed I used to call home." "It's perfect," Atsa said, and she meant it with every fibre of her being. It was perfect because it was theirs, earned through blood and fear and an unwavering refusal to give up on each other. She reached up and tenderly touched his face. "A cowboy won a marriage lottery for $5 and found the bride was a giant Apache woman. That's how the story starts. But this is how it ends. Not with him owning her, not with her needing him, but with two people choosing each other every single day." Tobias smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "That's a better ending than I deserve." "Then it's a good thing you don't get to decide what you deserve," she teased gently. She leaned in and kissed him softly. "I do." They held each other close in that tiny room as the settlement gradually drifted off to sleep around them. Outside, the world continued its relentless churn. Men still hunted, merchants still schemed, tribes still struggled. But in that room, in that singular moment, two people who had been told their entire lives that they were worthless had found something far more valuable than any gold. They found each other, and in each other they found home. 3 months later, they would stand before a circuit judge and make it official, with papers and signatures and all the trappings that society demanded. But the real marriage had already taken place. It happened when Tobias first refused to abandon her, when Atsa first smiled at him, when they fought together, ran together, and chose each other again and again. That was the marriage that truly mattered. Everything else was just a formality, playing catch-up. In the settlement, they built a life that was simple, honest, and entirely their own. Tobias found work at a local lumber mill. Atsa started a small business repairing saddles and tack. Her strong hands and meticulous craftsmanship quickly earned her a sterling reputation. People learned not to pry into their past, learned to respect the quiet strength they radiated. They learned that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones where two people, facing the world together, discover they are exponentially stronger together than they ever could have been apart. And when people inevitably asked Tobias if he regretted spending his last $5 on that lottery ticket, he always gave the same unwavering answer: "Best investment I ever made." If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where unlikely bonds are forged and courage is tested in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.